Abandoned by their 5 adopted children, elderly black couple William and Grace Jenkins face eviction from their lifelong home, forced into a crumbling Colorado mountain cabin with only their loyal dog Duke. Betrayed after decades of sacrifices, they uncover hidden treasures and healing hot springs, transforming ruin into a thriving paradise that exposes their kids' greed and sparks ultimate revenge. Abandoned by their adopted children, an elderly black couple transformed a dilapidated mountain cabin into a paradise. "Do you really think we're going to let this old dog get in the way of our plans?" Jonathan's voice cut through the chilly morning air as he watched the 9-year-old German shepherd shivering beside his adoptive parents. William and Grace Jenkins, both 72, watched silently as the movers carried the last pieces of furniture from their home to the truck. After 30 years of raising 5 adopted children as if they were their own, this was the repayment they received. "Dad, Mom, you know this is best for everyone," said Jennifer, the eldest daughter, adjusting her designer handbag while avoiding looking directly into Grace's teary eyes. "You can no longer take care of yourselves, let alone an animal." William held tight to the leash of Duke, the dog who had been the family's faithful companion for almost a decade. The animal seemed to sense the tension in the air, pressing himself against the legs of the man who had rescued him from the streets as a puppy. "We mortgaged this house to pay for Jonathan's medical school," Grace said, her voice steady despite her tears. "We spent our entire retirement savings saving Jennifer's restaurant when she was going bankrupt. Where was this concern for our well-being when you needed our money?" Michael, the 3rd child, waved impatiently at the truck driver. "That's different, Mom. Now you're sick, broke, and frankly, you've become a burden we can't carry." The statement hit like a bomb. 30 years of unconditional love, nights spent awake caring for fevers and nightmares, graduations attended with pride, weddings paid for with sacrifice, all summed up in one word: burden. "What about Duke?" William asked, his voice breaking for the first time. "The animal shelter is 20 kilometers from Grandpa's cabin," Jonathan replied coldly, handing over the keys to a rusty pickup truck. "If you insist on keeping him, that's your problem, but don't expect us to pay for the vet." Grace looked at the property in the Colorado mountains mentioned in William's grandfather's will, an abandoned cabin she had never visited in a region where winter killed. What the 5 ungrateful children didn't know was that William and Grace bore the scars of a lifetime of fighting adversity. Their eyes, despite the pain of betrayal, shone with a determination that only those who have survived the impossible can maintain. As the last car carrying the children disappeared down the road, Duke approached and laid his head on Grace's lap, as if promising that no matter what happened, they would face it together. If you've ever been betrayed by the one you loved most, then you know that true strength is revealed not in the fall, but in what we choose to build after it. Sign up to find out how this couple turned the cruelest abandonment into a victory their own children could never have imagined. The 280-kilometer drive to the Colorado mountains was silent torture. The 1998 pickup truck shook violently with every pothole in the road, and the heater had stopped working 50 kilometers back. Grace held Duke against her chest, both to warm him and to warm herself while William drove with his jaw clenched. "Remember when Jonathan broke his arm at age 8? Grace murmured, watching the desolate landscape through the foggy window. "We spent 3 nights in the hospital with him. We didn't leave his bedside, not even to eat." William nodded, the memories cutting like knives. He had worked double shifts at the factory for 2 years to pay for the orthopedic surgery that insurance didn't cover. Grace had sewn clothes until 2 a.m. for months to supplement their income, her fingers bleeding from pricking them with a needle. "And Jennifer," Grace continued, her voice breaking, "when she said she wanted to be an entrepreneur, we sold the only good car we had to put a down payment on her restaurant loan. What hurt the most wasn't just the financial sacrifices. It was the nights Grace spent awake helping with school projects, the weekends William gave up his rest to teach Michael to drive, the graduations where they were the only parents in attendance because the others were too busy with work." Duke suddenly raised his head, looking out the back window with an intensity that caught William's attention in the rearview mirror. The dog wasn't agitated or anxious. There was something almost protective in his posture, as if he were assessing whether they were being followed. "What is it, boy?" Grace asked, following the animal's gaze. The road behind them was empty, but Duke remained vigilant for a few more minutes before settling down again. The journey dragged on, each mile a reminder of the life they were leaving behind. William recalled Bradford's wedding, how they had skipped their own anniversary trip to cover the venue costs, or Kevin's college tuition that left them eating beans for months. Grace thought of the countless birthdays, the handmade cards, the encouragement during failures. Yet here they were, discarded like old furniture. Duke whined softly, nuzzling closer, his presence a small comfort in the rattling truck. As the mountains loomed larger, the couple's resolve hardened. They had survived worse, and with Duke by their side, they would endure this too. When they finally arrived at the property, the reality was even worse than they had imagined. Grandpa's cabin was a rotting wooden structure with half the roof collapsed and broken windows covered with old boards. There was no electricity, running water, or any sign that the place was habitable. "My God," Grace whispered, getting out of the pickup truck and almost tripping over a pile of trash that the wind had blown against the collapsed porch. But it was Duke who first showed that something was different. While William and Grace contemplated the devastation, the dog began to sniff methodically around the property. It wasn't the typical behavior of an animal exploring new territory. It was something more systematic, almost as if he were looking for something specific. "At least we have the cabin," William said with bitter irony, pushing the door that creaked open on rusty hinges. The interior was even worse. Decades of neglect had allowed moisture, rodents, and insects to take over. Rotten furniture littered the floor. Holes in the floorboards revealed the stone foundation, and a smell of mold so strong it made Grace cough. That's when they found the first clue that the children had lied about more than just the condition of the property. Behind a pile of yellowed newspapers from 1987, Grace discovered a plastic folder protecting legal documents. "William," she called, her voice strangely firm, "you need to see this." The papers revealed that the property was not just an abandoned cabin. It was part of an old mining concession that included rights to 50 hectares of mountainous land, water rights from natural springs, and most importantly, permanent tax exemptions as a historic landmark. "They knew," William said, leafing through the documents with growing indignation. "Jonathan is a lawyer. He knew exactly what this property was worth when they sent us here." Grace held up a specific document, a 2019 appraisal estimating the property's value at $380,000. Taking into account its potential for sustainable development and rural tourism. The betrayal deepened. The children hadn't just abandoned them. They'd schemed to inherit valuable land by letting nature do the dirty work. Duke barked from outside, drawing them back to the present, his tail wagging as if to say there was more to uncover. Duke appeared at the door, carrying something in his mouth. It was an old rust-covered key, which he dropped at William's feet before running outside again, barking once as if calling them to follow him. The dog led them to a semi-burrowed structure behind the main cabin, a kind of basement or storage room that had gone unnoticed during their first inspection. The key Duke had found opened the padlock securing the entrance. Inside, protected from deterioration, they found construction tools, preserved materials, and most importantly, a diesel generator in perfect condition, along with gallons of still usable fuel. "How did he know?" Grace asked, watching Duke sit proudly beside his discovery. William examined the generator with the eyes of someone who had spent decades keeping industrial machinery running. "It's all here. Everything we need to start rebuilding." For the first time since the forced eviction, Grace smiled. It was not a smile of resignation, but of determination. "They sent us here thinking they would get rid of us quietly, that we would die in the winter, and they would inherit everything without a guilty conscience." William nodded, new energy coursing through his veins. 50 years working with my hands, building and fixing things. Did they really think 2 retired bricklayers couldn't survive in a cabin? Duke barked approvingly, as if he understood that the initial discouragement had been replaced by something much more dangerous for those who had underestimated them. 2 natural survivors with time, motivation, and now enough resources to prove they had made a terrible mistake. What the 5 ungrateful children couldn't imagine was that every humiliation, every cruel word, every gesture of contempt was feeding a flame that would soon become an uncontrollable fire. And Duke, with his keen instincts and unwavering loyalty, seemed to be just the first sign that the universe had chosen a side in this battle. Over the next days, they inventoried the tools, hammers, saws, nails, all preserved in oilcloth, a legacy from William's grandfather who had been a miner turned homesteader. The fuel was fresh enough to power the generator, bringing light to the cabin for the first time in years. The first days of work on the property revealed that 50 years of construction experience were worth more than any college course the children had attended. William and Grace divided the tasks methodically. He focused on the structure of the cabin while she organized supplies and created a water purification system using improvised filters. Duke, however, continued to exhibit inexplicable behavior. Every morning the dog would disappear for hours, always returning wet and smelling different. Not like mud or a common river, but something Grace described as water that smells like medicine. "Where have you been getting into, boy?" William asked. On the 5th day, watching Duke shake off water droplets that seemed to make his coat shinier than before. The answer came when Grace tripped and twisted her ankle while carrying wood. The pain was intense, the swelling immediate, and they had no way to get to a hospital. That's when Duke did something extraordinary. He gently took the hem of Grace's pants between his teeth and began pulling her toward the forest. "He wants me to follow," said Grace, leaning on William. The dog led them up a steep trail that neither of them had noticed before, stopping only when they reached a clearing where warm vapors rose from a pool of crystal-clear water surrounded by natural rocks. "A hot spring," William whispered, touching the water reverently. "I've never seen one this hot and clean." Grace immersed her injured foot in the warm water, and the relief was immediate. Not only did the pain subside, the swelling began to visibly reduce. "William, this isn't normal. There's something special about this water." Duke sat proudly beside the spring as if presenting a treasure kept especially for them. That night, as Grace tested the mobility of her fully healed ankle, they received their first visitor since arriving. An old pickup truck drove up the dirt road and out stepped a man in his 60s with gray hair and calloused hands that indicated manual labor. "I'm Frank Morrison, a retired veterinarian," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "I live on the neighboring property about 3 miles from here. I came to see if you were all right. It's not common to see people moving here in the winter." Duke immediately approached Frank, allowing the man to examine him with professional eyes. "This dog is in exceptional condition for his age. 9 years old, I'd guess, but with a vitality of a 3-year-old. "Dr. Morrison," Grace began carefully, "have you ever heard of hot springs with medicinal properties?" The veterinarian's eyes lit up. "Ah, you found the springs. My grandfather used to talk about them. He said the local Indians used them as sacred healing places. But after mining started, everyone forgot about them." Frank explained that he had grown up hearing legends about waters that healed both humans and animals, but he had never been able to locate them. "If Duke led you there, it's because he trusts you. These German shepherd dogs have an incredible instinct for these things." Over the next 2 weeks, Frank became a regular visitor, helping with repairs and bringing supplies from town. More importantly, he observed the dramatic changes in William and Grace. "Grace, your arthritis," Frank commented during a visit. "You're moving completely differently." It was true. The chronic pain that had plagued Grace for years had virtually disappeared after daily baths in the spring. William had also noticed that his back pain, the result of decades of heavy lifting and construction, had become just a memory. "And that's not all," said William, flexing his fingers, which used to lock up every morning. "I sleep better. I have more energy. It's like I'm getting younger." Frank, scientifically skeptical by nature, decided to test the water. He brought basic equipment from his retired veterinary clinic and discovered extraordinary mineral concentrations, magnesium, sulfur, and compounds he couldn't identify with his limited instruments. "You need to document this," he insisted. "But be careful. If the wrong information gets to the wrong people, this place could be destroyed by commercial development." It was during this conversation that Grace received the first call from her children since they had left. Jennifer, the eldest daughter, called with a falsely concerned voice. "Mom, we heard you're trying to renovate that old cabin. That's dangerous at your age. Why don't you consider the nursing home offer we found?" "We're fine here, Jennifer," Grace replied calmly, watching Duke play energetically in the yard. "Better than we've been in years." "Mom, be realistic. You can't afford proper renovations, and that old dog must be a lot of work. Duke is fine. In fact, he's never been better." There was a pause before Jennifer continued. "Look, Mom. Jonathan researched this property. It's worth nothing but the land. You're wasting what's left of your savings on an impossible dream." Grace hung up the phone with a smile that Frank couldn't help but notice. "Do your children still think they know you better than you know yourselves?" asked the veterinarian. "They know the people we used to be," Grace replied. "They have no idea who we've become." That night, sitting around the fire that now warmed the restored cabin, William, Grace, and Frank planned something their children could never imagine. With Duke lying between them, seeming to supervise the conversation, they sketched out a plan that would not only transform their lives, but create something their ungrateful children could never destroy or steal. "You know," said Frank, watching Duke get up and walk to the window, looking out at the forest where the springs awaited. "This dog isn't just special. He's the key to something much bigger than any of us can imagine." Duke turned to them, his eyes shining in the firelight, as if he understood perfectly well that his true mission was just beginning. And there, in that cabin that the children had considered a death sentence, 3 survivors and 1 extraordinary dog began to write a story of rebirth that would make all those who had underestimated them bitterly regret every cruel word, every gesture of contempt, every moment they believed that age and apparent weakness meant defeat. What the 5 ungrateful children could not even imagine was that their own weapons, abandonment, isolation, and underestimation were becoming the foundations of an empire of healing that would soon attract the attention not only of the local community, but of people willing to pay any price for what they had found for free in the mountains. Months later, the call came on a Sunday morning as William watched a line of cars climbing the mountain road toward the property. Jonathan's voice was different, less arrogant, more urgent. "Dad, I need you to explain to me what the hell is going on up there in the mountains. I'm seeing posts on Instagram about a miracle healing sanctuary that looks suspiciously like Grandpa's property." William smiled as he watched Duke carefully guide an elderly man with a cane toward the main spring. The dog had become a local legend. Veterinarians came from 3 states just to study his diagnostic methods. "Just taking care of the property you guys thought was worthless," William replied calmly. "Dad, the website says you're charging $800 per weekend. There's a 6-month waiting list. Is that true?" In fact, it was more than that. The Duke Ranch, as it had been affectionately named by visitors, hosted 12 people at a time in rustic cabins that William and Frank had built. Each visit included 3 guided sessions at the hot springs, organic meals from Grace's garden, and most importantly, Duke's personalized assessment for the ideal treatment. $800 seems too expensive to you, son. Considering that you thought the place wasn't even worth the taxes, there was a tense silence before Jonathan continued. "Dad, the family lawyer needs to review all the legal documents for this operation. There may be civil liability issues that you're not considering." "How convenient. Now you're concerned about our legal well-being." Grace appeared on the porch carrying a tray of herbal tea for the guests. At 72, she looked 10 years younger, her skin glowing with the vitality that the hot springs had restored. Her hair, which had been completely gray on the day of the eviction, now showed natural dark highlights. It was Grace who answered when Jennifer called the next day, this time with a different approach. "Mom, we heard you've built a successful business." "That's wonderful. Maybe it's time to think about expanding, bringing in professional investors, creating a real brand," Jennifer Grace interrupted gently. "Where was this entrepreneurial excitement when we were evicted from our home?" "Mom, we were hasty. Now we see that you were right about the property's potential. As a family, we can work together to maximize." Grace hung up the phone and turned to William. They found out about the money. It was true. Over the past 6 months, in addition to revenue from healing retreats, they had received offers for documentaries, partnerships with universities for scientific research on the mineral properties of the springs, and even interest from a boutique hotel chain to license the Duke method of animal-assisted therapy. Frank, now an official partner in the business, had brought in contacts from his veterinary network, who turned local discoveries into national interest. Articles in medical journals documented the inexplicable results patients experienced at the ranch. But it was when the CNN report aired that the 5 children finally understood the magnitude of what they had lost. Duke Ranch, the miracle of the Colorado Mountains air during prime time, showing Duke guiding visitors, the facilities restored with artisal perfection, and interviews with doctors astonished by their patients' results. The reporter interviewed Grace in the garden where she grew medicinal herbs,